Hello, my name is Eligon and welcome to my presentation, Language Contextually in the Brain. Today we're looking at similarities and differences in language areas between hearing persons and profoundly deaf persons who sign. For the purpose of this presentation, we will specifically be looking at ASL, American Sign Language. Our content breakdown today is language is normally acquired and wired in the brains of spoken language, a little bit on how language is acquired and wired in the brains of profoundly deaf persons, sign language individuals, similarities and differences, a bit of some findings and conclusions that I came upon, and of course my very excited page. First, let's go into a bit of language in hearing brains. So we're going to look at the important lobes that play a huge role in language acquisition, regardless of deaf or hearing. Because of course both brains will have a frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Our frontal lobe houses, the left hemisphere houses a lot of our language areas, our focus areas, and our Wernicke's area is also located in that frontal lobe. And the back, there's the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, which houses our visual cortex, and our temporal lobe, which houses our auditory cortex. Our auditory cortex, which takes in and transmits a lot of the outside stimuli to a form that each of our brain areas can understand and therefore transcribe and do its thing, for lack of better words. Then we can move on to our language areas, which I just briefly discussed, that are housed in the frontal lobe. From young, our brain is starting to wire certain parts of our brains to be responsible for certain things. So we train our Brooks area for our speech production, our Wernicke's area for our Mexican lexicon, where it's held and whatnot. Typically, we'll pause here for a little while just briefly talk about how language is acquired in spoken brain. And that is through exposure predominantly. We as babies, our children are exposed constantly to our speech, and as such, like little sponges, they absorb everything as the brain does at such a young age. And from that absorption and repetition and constant contextual exposure, we learn language. And our language areas grow and they myelinate, and then by a certain age set in their ways, which brings us to the critical period hypothesis, in which it suggests that we have a particular period between to puberty in which we will acquire our full developmental language. Anything after that, it becomes hard for our brain to be more flexible and malleable. That's why it's so hard for us to learn languages after that period. Just before we jump into language in the brains of profoundly deaf people, I would just like to reiterate from Dr. Melissa Lee Phillips from the Neuroscience for Kids Consultant. She said that typically we start with where language is typically produced and transmitted in the brain of hearing persons, and it's typically tends to be processed on the left cerebral hemisphere, not surprisingly, as that is where our language areas are housed. Moving on so let me ask the question then, how is language really wired if we can't hear, if we get a lot of our stimuli, which is transmitted through our auditory cortex? How is that affecting a deaf person? So we go on to the next slide, which speaks about language in the brains of profoundly deaf persons who sign, specifically American Sign Language. Just wanted to put a little image out here already. We can see some differences in hearing and hearing and deaf persons. We just by looking at the left and right hemisphere and comparing them, we can already see differences in areas activated when stimulated and asked questions, whether the response was to sign or to speak. While there are not too many differences, there are little noticeable differences in the magnitude in which the areas do light up in hearing persons. The left hemisphere does significantly light up more of the white matter is activated as opposed to deaf, as we can see as well in the right hemisphere for both. However, we can see there's a bit more activity in the right hemisphere in the deaf persons that there are in the hearing persons. And we will look more into that as we go into similarities and differences. So we will pause on this slide just to talk about how language is acquired and wired a bit in the brains of deaf, predominantly deaf native signers. And from YouTube videos to different research projects, we see that children pick up sign languages as quickly as they pick up spoken language when they are deaf. As soon as parents start signing to them, they create their own little signs and they're able to acquire just as quickly. And we saw that, funnily enough, regardless of if it's not spoken and heard, the same language areas in hearing brains are activated in the brains of those who are deaf. So another point to note is that just as spoken language has a critical period hypothesis, there is the same for profoundly deaf persons. According to a study from Arnold Newman and his colleagues at the University of Oregon, there may be a similar type of CPH involved in processing of American Sign Language in the right hemisphere. The research showed that the right angular gyrus is highly activated during ASL processing, and people who learn the language from birth versus those after puberty. This study emphasized how crucial a role the right hemisphere plays in signing and understanding signing. Just a bit more on the native signers versus the late signers, just a bit of a comparison and how similar that this critical period hypothesis is. In many cases with the feral children, when that child was 13 and passed that critical period hypothesis, while she regained many of her other cognitive skills, she never fully got her proper language acquisition development. And this study also had shown that late signers weren't as fluent and it wasn't as natural to them as it was for native signers. In the next slide, we can see 3 different brains that were compared. Regular hearing subjects, deaf subjects, who and then hearing native signers. And interestingly enough, the brain reacted differently when activated. We are going to note from an article, Sign Language in the Brain, from Ruth Campbell and Mick Sweeney, from the Journal of Deaf Studies and Journal of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education, Volume 13. Although our language processing areas lie very close to auditory processing regions, language processing is not determined by the auditory input modality. These findings help establish sign languages as real languages, so that we see already that a lot of myths are just that burst their bubble, in that while a lot of hearing brains take auditory stimuli and transmit that into forms that our language areas can understand, that does not affect how the language areas respond that much in deaf persons. However, it is noted that the right hemisphere contributes to a greater extent with signing than spoken languages. And we can understand that because the right hemisphere is dominant for a range of visuospatial processing abilities. And this is from Hillich in 1993. He said that. So that the brain is known to compensate for losses. So we see that a lot of blind people, their sense of smell and hearing are heightened, as is the case for those who are deaf. Their sense of visual appreciation, they notice a lot more things that a person of a hearing brain wouldn't, because they have to compensate for a lack of skill. Let us jump into differences and similarities. A quote that I really appreciated from Eden from the Georgetown University in 2014. He said that we found that our deaf and hearing participants, irrespective of language difference, differed in the volume of brain white matter in their auditory cortex. But also we found differences in left hemisphere areas, and these differences were specific to those whose native language was American Sign Language. So jumping into that a bit, this is one difference that we did find. Whereas the gray brain matter did not differ in volume, the white matter did, and this was because our white matter is myelinated, hence the color is white. So we can understand that because there's no auditory stimuli to be processed, and therefore no activation or stimulation in that part of our temporal lobe, and therefore there's understandably a decreased volume of white brain matter. That does not seem to affect the language areas. Another similarity, funnily, was from Hauser from the University RIT. He said that deaf children raised by deaf parents are able to achieve the same basic reading skills as hearing individuals in early life, suggesting that deafness per se does not cause reading challenges, but what does have an effect is being raised in improvised visual language environments that do not foster learning. I think it's very similar to hearing brains, in that if children are not exposed properly to proper language and appropriate language, then their speech is not going to be what it should be, and we can say the same therefore for deaf persons. However, with regards to this, so that regardless of if you can hear or not, your reading skills is not affected. Language is interpreted and understood in the same way in both brains. Just quickly jumping back to this difference with the brain matter, another citation from the brain structure in deaf persons and MRI differences. MRI imaging from the American Journal of Neuroradiology, Dr. D.K. Shibata, in 2007, she said alterations in brain anatomy as a consequence of early deafness. The white matter deficit in the posterior left superior temporal gyrus may represent hypoplasia of the auditory speech related tracts. Hemispheric asymmetries, however, remain largely intact. Just a very important thing to note as well. Moving on from that, this is another example of the differences of the left and right hemisphere when compared in neural imaging. We are quickly going to go on to our conclusions and findings, which I found that from Eden and Georgetown University. He said that we've learned to date about differences in brain anatomy in hearing and deaf populations, but haven't taken into account the diverse language experiences among people who are deaf. So that is something I definitely think we need to take into account and do more research on. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope I have been clear. Please see my Excited page.